There was a time many years ago when this England of ours was a savage country. The oldest stories that we read about our island happened so long ago that the English had not yet come to the land where we live. In those days, the country was not called England, but Britain, and the people were the ancient Britons. In the time of the Britons, the greater part of the country was covered with moors and swamps, and with great forests where dangerous wild animals lived, wolves and bears and wildcats, where herds of deer wandered and droves of wild cattle. The ancient Britons lived in huts built of branches of trees plastered with mud, very low in the roof and dark, having no windows, and there were no chimneys to let out the smoke. Their villages were only collections of huts surrounded by a fence or stockade and a ditch to keep out the wild animals, as well as other Britons who were enemies of the tribe, for these wild people were always fighting among themselves. The Britons had blue eyes and yellow or reddish hair, which both men and women wore long and hanging over their shoulders. In summer, they went about with their chests and shoulders almost bare, and in winter they clothed themselves in the skins of animals killed in the chase. They were a wild people, but so brave that we like to hear stories about them. About 2,000 years ago, when the Britons were living their savage life, there lived in the country which is now Italy another people called the Romans. These Romans were one of the greatest and wisest nations that have ever lived. It seems strange that they should have left their own beautiful country to come to Britain with its cold climate and savage inhabitants, but they were a very ambitious people who would not be content until they had subdued every other nation of the earth. The Romans had already conquered all the nations round about their own country when the Emperor Claudius became their chief. But Claudius wished to win glory by making fresh conquests, and he determined to subdue the wild northern island of Britain. Knowing that the Britons were a very fierce and brave people, he sent against them an army of 40,000 men under the command of two skillful generals. When the inhabitants of southern Britain saw the sea about their coasts covered with Roman vessels, while more vessels were always appearing above the horizon, their anger and dismay knew no bounds. They knew that the Romans were the bravest and most skillful soldiers in the world, and that they had come to conquer them if they could, and to take their country away from them. As the soldiers, wearing their glittering breastplates and helmets of polished steel, and with the sun flashing upon the gold and silver eagles which they carried for standards, landed from their vessels and marched on their way to the place where they were going to make their camp, the Britons watched them from their hiding places with both rage and terror. Still, they did not despair. Old men among them were able to tell them how their ancestors had withstood the Romans who had come to their shores 100 years before, and how the great Julius Caesar had been glad to make peace with the Britons and sail away to his own country. Messengers were sent far and near to some of the chiefs and their followers, and they resolved to fight to the last. The Britons proved to be some of the most determined foes that the Romans had ever met. Battle after battle was fought, and the country still remained unsubdued. Sometimes the Romans won, and sometimes the Britons were masters of the day. The Romans were trained soldiers, while their opponents were wild and undisciplined savages. But the Britons were fighting for their homes and freedom, and that made them very brave. Among the British leaders, the noblest was a chieftain of the name of Caradoc, or, as the Romans called him, Caractacus. When some of the other chiefs, having been defeated many times, were forced to make peace with the invaders, Caradoc refused to yield. Fighting stubbornly, he contested every inch of southern Britain, but was slowly driven backwards to the mountains of Wales. Here he gathered around him a band of Britons as brave and determined as himself, and for nearly 9 years he held the Romans in check. The invaders, who did not know the country, were unable to penetrate far among these valleys, where thick forests hemmed in the view, and where every hillside might harbor a band of their savage foes. It was impossible to reach Caradoc in this wild retreat. Accompanied by his followers, he would leave the mountains and sweep suddenly down upon a Roman camp in some distant part of the country. At a time when the Romans were least expecting it, a band of these wild red-headed warriors would appear, yelling their war cries as they let fly a shower of darts and arrows. Then, after killing and wounding a number of the enemy, they would vanish among their mountains before the Romans had time to follow them up. As years went on, a large number of Britons found their way to Caradoc in his Welsh retreat. The mountains became full of desperate men who had been driven from their homes, but were still determined to fight for freedom, and the example of their leader gave his followers fresh courage. After many years of fighting, the Romans saw that the country would never be subdued so long as Caradoc should remain at liberty. A great army was marched towards the stronghold of the daring chief. Caradoc mustered his retainers and found himself at the head of a body of men almost as numerous as the Roman army. For 9 years, these Britons had remained unconquered, and the brave band hoped that the day had now come when they might gain a victory which would end in the invaders being driven out of the country. Romans and Britons met on the borders of Wales. The Britons, looking down from their mountains, saw the Romans on the plain far below. Between the armies there flowed a river, which was joined by a torrent, rushing down by the side of a steep hill. Caradoc ordered his men to take up their station upon this hill, and all night long the Britons worked to strengthen their defenses by building up barricades of loose stones. When morning dawned, the Britons could see the Roman legions forming in position. The sunbeams were glancing upon the crests of the soldiers' helmets and upon the points of their spears, and the Britons almost seemed to hear the voice of the general who was riding his prancing war horse round the ranks of his army. The Britons were eager to attack, but before a man left his post, Caradoc came forward and spoke to his followers. "Men of Britain," he said, "this day decides the fate of your country. Your liberty or your eternal slavery dates from this hour. Remember your brave ancestors who drove the great Julius himself across the sea.